Picture this. In the dry, red heart of Australia, Aboriginal elders gather their children and tell them about the great flood that covered the world. They speak of ancestors who fled to the highest mountains as the waters rose, swallowing everything below. They say only a few survived to tell the tale. Now travel halfway across the planet to ancient Mesopotamia. 5,000 years ago, Sumerian priests carved into clay tablets the story of Utnapishtim, a man warned by the gods that a catastrophic flood would destroy all life. He built a massive boat, saved his family and animals, and when the waters receded, he became the sole survivor of a world that had been washed away. Cross the ocean to South America. The Inca tell nearly the identical story. A great flood sent by the creator god Viracocha destroyed the world. Only 2 people survived on a mountain peak. From them, humanity began again. Sail north to Scandinavia. The Vikings spoke of a flood that would one day consume the world during Ragnarok, but they also remembered a flood from the distant past, when the blood of the slain giant Ymir flooded the earth and drowned all but 2 humans who hid in the world tree. Jump to ancient Greece. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive a catastrophic flood sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth of wicked humanity. Their boat comes to rest on a mountain. They repopulate the world by throwing stones that transform into people. And of course there is the story everyone knows. Noah and the Ark. 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Every living thing destroyed except what Noah saved. The boat landing on Mount Ararat. The rainbow promise that it would never happen again. 6 different cultures, 6 different continents, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Cultures that never contacted each other, never traded stories, never even knew the others existed. Yet they all tell the same story. Not similar stories, the same story. A global catastrophe, rising waters, total destruction, a handful of survivors, humanity starting over. Mainstream archaeology calls this coincidence. They say humans naturally create flood myths because floods are scary and memorable. They argue that every culture experiences local flooding, so every culture invents a flood story. The similarities, they insist, are just the product of universal human psychology. But here is what they cannot explain. These are not just vague stories about big rainstorms. These myths describe the same specific details, the same timeline, the same sequence of events. Waters rising fast enough that people could not escape. The entire world submerged. Only the highest peaks remaining above water. A select few survivors warned ahead of time. Animals saved in pairs. A vessel that preserves the seeds of the old world. And then, after the waters recede, mysterious teachers arriving to help the survivors rebuild civilization. The statistical probability of this being coincidence is astronomical. We are talking about hundreds of cultures across every inhabited continent, telling precisely the same story with precisely the same details. Aboriginal Australians, whose oral traditions stretch back 40,000 years. Mesopotamian civilizations from 12,000 years ago. Mayan codices, Chinese legends, Hawaiian chants, Persian texts. They all describe the same cataclysm. What if these are not myths at all? What if they are memories? What if, roughly 12,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened to our planet? Something so devastating that it nearly wiped out humanity entirely. Something that destroyed an advanced civilization we have forgotten ever existed. Something that left only scattered survivors to pass down the story through generations until it became mythology. The evidence is there. Geologists have found proof of massive flooding events that reshaped continents in a matter of days. Archaeologists keep discovering structures that should not exist, built with technology that supposedly primitive humans could never possess. Climatologists have identified a sudden, violent shift in Earth's climate that occurred exactly when these myths say the flood happened. And astronomers have recently confirmed that around 10,800 BCE, something from space slammed into our planet with enough force to trigger an extinction-level event. The establishment does not want to talk about it. Careers have been destroyed for suggesting that human civilization is older than we have been taught. Evidence has been suppressed. Sites have been restricted. Researchers have been ridiculed and blacklisted. Because if these myths are real, If there really was a global catastrophe that destroyed an advanced pre-flood civilization, then everything we think we know about human history is wrong. Tonight, we are going to examine the evidence they do not want you to see. We are going to visit the impossible structures that survived the flood. We are going to decode the warnings ancient people left carved in stone. We are going to show you the geological proof that something terrible happened to this planet. And we are going to ask the question nobody in academia wants to answer. If these myths all describe the same global disaster, what really happened 12,000 years ago? Hey, I am Mr. H, and you have just stumbled onto something that is going to change how you see human history. If this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because we are about to go deep into the mysteries they do not teach in school. And make sure you click that notification bell so you do not miss what is coming next. Because every piece of evidence we uncover just makes this mystery bigger. The answer is hidden in plain sight. It is buried under the ocean. It is carved into megaliths. It is written in ancient texts. It is locked away in museum basements. And it is encoded in stories that every culture on Earth has been telling for thousands of years. Let us find out why ancient myths all describe the same global disaster. The first thing you need to understand is just how specific these flood myths are. We are not talking about vague references to rain or rivers overflowing. We are talking about detailed, eerily similar accounts of a worldwide catastrophe that destroyed everything. Let us start with the oldest written story in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is not some obscure text. It is literally the first epic poem ever recorded, carved into clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 2600 BCE. But the story itself is far older. Scholars believe it preserves memories from at least 5,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. In the epic, a man named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about the time the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. The god Enki warns Utnapishtim in a dream. He tells him to tear down his house and build a boat. Not just any boat, a massive vessel with specific dimensions. Utnapishtim is instructed to bring aboard his family, craftsmen to preserve human knowledge, and animals of every kind. The flood comes, it rages for 6 days and 7 nights. When it ends, the boat lands on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test if the waters have receded. First a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which also returns. Finally, a raven, which does not come back, signaling that land has reappeared. Now here is where it gets interesting. This story predates the biblical flood narrative by at least 1,000 years. When archaeologists first translated these tablets in the 1800s, it caused absolute chaos in religious circles. The story of Noah was not original. It was a retelling of something far more ancient. But wait, it goes deeper. In India, the ancient Hindu text, known as the Satapatha Brahmana, tells the story of Manu, the first man. The god Vishnu appears to Manu as a fish and warns him that a great flood will destroy all life. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a boat and fill it with seeds and animals. The flood comes and destroys the world. Manu's boat is tethered to the fish, which pulls it to safety on a mountain peak. When the waters subside, Manu performs a sacrifice, and from that sacrifice, a woman is born. Together they repopulate the earth. Same story, different continent, different culture, different gods, but the same sequence of events. Travel to ancient Greece. The poet Apollonius writes about Deucalion, son of Prometheus. Zeus decides humanity has become too wicked and must be destroyed. Prometheus warns his son. Deucalion builds an ark. The flood comes. Everything is destroyed. The ark drifts for 9 days and nights before landing on Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and his wife are the only survivors. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. Again, the same pattern. Divine warning, boat construction, total destruction, mountain landing. Survivors restart humanity. Now let us go somewhere really unexpected. The Hawaiian Islands. In ancient Hawaiian tradition, there is a story about a man named Nuu. The god Cain becomes angry with humanity's corruption and decides to destroy the world with a flood. Cain warns Nuu ahead of time. Nuu builds a large canoe and brings his family aboard, along with pairs of animals. The flood comes and covers everything except the peaks of the highest mountains. When the waters recede, Nu makes offerings to the moon, mistaking it for Cain. The real Cain appears and corrects him, and Nu becomes the ancestor of all people who came after. These islands were settled by Polynesians who had zero contact with Middle Eastern or European cultures, yet their flood story contains the exact same elements: the warning, the boat, the animals, the mountain peaks, the sole survivors. Let me take you to China. The story of Gun and Yu describes a catastrophic flood that covered the earth during the reign of Emperor Yao. The flood lasted for decades. Gun tries to stop it by building dams, but fails. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels to drain the waters. But here is the key detail. The flood is described as covering the entire world, reaching the heavens, swallowing hills and mountains. This is not a local river flood. This is a global deluge. The Aztecs have a flood story. The Mayans have a flood story. The Inca have a flood story. The Algonquian tribes of North America have a flood story. The Yoruba people of West Africa have a flood story. The Aboriginal Australians, whose oral traditions are the oldest continuous culture on Earth, spanning 40,000 years or more, have multiple flood stories. And here is what makes the Australian stories so important. These are people who arrived on the continent at least 60,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They have been isolated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years. No contact with Mesopotamia, no contact with India, no contact with Greece or China or the Americas. Yet their elders tell stories about a time when the sea levels rose so fast that people had to flee inland, when coastal lands were swallowed by water, when entire tribes were wiped out by rising oceans. Modern archaeology has confirmed this. Sea levels did rise dramatically at the end of the last ice age. The coast of Australia was once hundreds of miles farther out. Entire landscapes that Aboriginal people lived on for thousands of years are now underwater, and they remember it. They pass down the memory through 40,000 years of oral tradition. But mainstream scholars still insist this is all coincidence. They argue that flood myths are simply a natural result of humans living near water. Every culture experiences floods, so every culture invents flood stories. The similarities, they claim, are just convergent mythology. Except that does not explain the specifics. It does not explain why cultures separated by oceans and millennia all include the same unique details. The advance warning from a deity, the construction of a vessel with precise dimensions, the inclusion of animals in pairs, the landing on a mountain after the waters recede, the sending of birds to test for dry land, the survival of only a handful of people, the restart of civilization from these survivors. These are not generic flood stories. These are specific, detailed accounts of the same event. And then there is the pattern nobody talks about. In nearly every one of these myths, there is mention of survivors who bring knowledge to help rebuild. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood and returned after to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The Egyptians spoke of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, a mysterious group from before the time of the pharaohs who possessed advanced knowledge. The Mayans spoke of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god who came from across the sea to teach astronomy, architecture, and agriculture. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, a bearded white figure who appeared after the flood and taught the survivors how to farm, build, and organize society. Who were these teachers? Where did they come from? And why do cultures around the world describe the same figures arriving after the flood with the same knowledge? Mainstream archaeology has no answer for this. They dismiss these figures as mythological gods, products of primitive imagination. But what if these myths preserve a real memory? What if there really were survivors from a pre-flood civilization who traveled the world trying to preserve their knowledge before it was lost forever? Think about it. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, if some catastrophe destroyed 99% of humanity, what would the survivors remember 1,000 years later? They would remember the disaster. They would remember that there was a great civilization before. They would remember that some people survived and tried to pass on what they knew. Over generations, those memories would transform into stories. Those stories would become myths. And those myths would sound exactly like what we are looking at right now. The flood myths are too consistent, too detailed and too widespread to be coincidence. They describe the same disaster, the same timeline, the same survivors, and the same aftermath. Cultures that never met tell the same story, and the story they tell matches geological evidence we are only now beginning to understand. Something happened, something terrible, something that nearly ended humanity, and every culture on Earth remembers it. Every culture on Earth remembers it. Hey, quick question. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments. And what time is it where you are? I am curious how far this message is reaching. Are you listening to this at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep because you are going down the rabbit hole? Or maybe it is your lunch break and you are supposed to be working, but this is way more interesting. Let me know. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It reminds me that these questions, these mysteries about our past, they matter to people everywhere. We are all trying to figure out the same thing. What really happened to our ancestors? All right, let's keep going. So we have established that every culture on Earth tells the same flood story. Now comes the moment when science stops laughing and starts paying attention. Because around 12,800 years ago, something absolutely catastrophic happened to this planet, and we have the physical evidence to prove it. This is called the Younger Dryas period. The name comes from a flower, Dryas octopetala, that suddenly appeared all over Europe during this time. Scientists use it as a marker because it only grows in Arctic conditions, which tells you something terrifying. Europe, which had been warming up nicely after the Ice Age, suddenly plunged back into glacial conditions almost overnight. We are not talking about gradual cooling over centuries. We are talking about temperature drops of 20 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Some ice core samples suggest it happened even faster. 3 years, maybe less. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine waking up one morning and the climate has completely changed. Your farmland is frozen, your water sources are iced over. The animals you hunt have either died or migrated away. This is not a bad winter. This is permanent. This is the new reality. And it lasts for 1,200 years. What could cause something like that? For decades, scientists argued about it. Some said it was changes in ocean currents. Others blamed volcanic activity. Some suggested melting ice sheets released so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that it disrupted the Gulf Stream. All plausible theories. None of them could explain the speed of the change or the global nature of the catastrophe. Then, in 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published a paper that changed everything. They proposed something radical. What if the Younger Dryas was not caused by gradual climate processes? What if something hit us from space? The hypothesis goes like this. Around 10,800 BCE, Earth passed through the debris field of a fragmenting comet. Multiple impacts struck the northern hemisphere. Some hit the ice sheets covering North America and Europe. The impacts were massive. We are talking about explosions equivalent to millions of nuclear bombs. The ice sheets, which were already 2 miles thick in places, absorbed most of the direct damage. But the thermal shock was unimaginable. Imagine dropping something so hot into ice that thick that it instantly vaporizes billions of tons of water. The steam alone would have shot into the atmosphere with the force of volcanic eruptions. The heat would have caused massive portions of the ice sheets to melt catastrophically. Not over centuries, over days, maybe hours. Now here is where it gets truly terrifying. When you melt that much ice that fast, where does the water go? Into the oceans. All at once. Sea levels do not rise gradually. They surge. Coastal areas around the entire planet would have been inundated with zero warning. Tidal waves hundreds of feet high racing inland at hundreds of miles per hour. Everything at low elevation gets drowned. Everything. And that is just the water. The impacts would have thrown millions of tons of debris into the atmosphere. Dust, ash, vaporized rock, all of it blocking out the Sunday temperatures plummet. The remaining ice sheets start growing again instead of melting. Animals that survived the initial impacts now face starvation. Megafauna that had thrived for millions of years go extinct within a generation. Woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American camels and horses, mastodons, all gone. Not gradually. Suddenly, humans nearly go extinct too. Genetic studies show a massive population bottleneck right around this time. Humanity was reduced to perhaps a few thousand individuals worldwide. We came within a hair of disappearing entirely. Now, when this hypothesis was first published, the academic establishment lost its mind. They attacked it viciously, called it pseudoscience, said there was no evidence, accused the researchers of being catastrophists, which in academic circles is apparently an insult. The idea that Earth's history is shaped by sudden violent events rather than slow, gradual processes goes against everything modern geology was built on. A scientist named Charles Lyell established the principle of uniformitarianism back in the 1830s. The idea that the present is the key to the past, that everything happens slowly and gradually, no catastrophes, no sudden changes, just slow, steady processes over millions of years. But here is the problem. The evidence for the Younger Dryas impact kept piling up, and it became impossible to ignore. Researchers found a layer of sediment dating to exactly 10,800 BCE that appears all over the northern hemisphere. This layer contains things that should not be there. Nanodiamonds. These are microscopic diamonds that only form under extreme temperature and pressure, like what you would get from a cosmic impact. They found magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock that formed when material was ejected into the atmosphere and rained back down. They found high concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. They found a black layer of sediment across North America called the Black Mat. It sits right at the Younger Dryas boundary. Below it, you find evidence of human habitation and abundant animal life. Above it, nothing. It is like someone drew a line through time and erased everything. Geologist Randall Carlson has spent decades documenting the physical scars left by this event. He focuses on something called the Channeled Scablands in Washington state. This is a landscape that looks like it was carved by flowing water, except the scale is wrong. We are not talking about rivers. We are talking about flows of water so massive, so powerful, that they ripped away hundreds of feet of solid bedrock and carried house-sized boulders hundreds of miles. Mainstream geology used to claim this landscape formed over millions of years of slow erosion. Then a scientist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed something different in the 1920s. He said the scablands were carved by catastrophic flooding, massive walls of water moving faster than a freight train, scouring everything in their path. He was ridiculed for decades. They called him a crackpot, but eventually the evidence became undeniable. He was right. The scablands were formed by megafloods. But where did that much water come from? The answer is the Cordilleran ice sheet, a massive wall of ice covering much of North America. When the comet fragments hit, the thermal shock caused huge portions of this ice sheet to collapse. Lakes of meltwater that had been trapped behind ice dams suddenly burst free. The amount of water released was equivalent to all the Great Lakes combined being dumped out in a matter of days. Carlson has identified similar flood scarring all over North America, in Montana, in Idaho, in Oregon. Everywhere you look, there is evidence of water flowing on a scale that should not be possible, and it all dates to the same period, the Younger Dryas boundary. But it was not just North America. Similar evidence has been found in Europe, in Asia, in South America. This was a global event. Antarctica ice cores tell the story from the bottom of the world. Scientists drill down through layers of ice, each layer representing a single year of snowfall. When they reach the layer from 10,800 BCE, the chemistry changes dramatically. There is a spike in atmospheric dust, a sudden shift in oxygen isotopes indicating rapid temperature change, and evidence of massive volcanic activity occurring simultaneously around the world. The megafauna extinction is another smoking gun. Within a geological instant, roughly 60 genera of large animals disappeared from North America alone. These were animals that had survived multiple ice ages over millions of years. They made it through warm periods and cold periods. They adapted to every climate shift Earth threw at them. Then suddenly, they are gone. All of them. At the same time, traditional science claims humans hunted them to extinction. But that does not hold up. There were not enough humans, and we did not have the technology to wipe out entire species across 2 continents in the span of a few decades. Besides, many of these animals went extinct in places humans had not even reached yet. Something else killed them. Something sudden and overwhelming. Graham Hancock has been talking about this for years. He is not a scientist. He is a journalist. And the academic establishment hates him for it. They call him a pseudoscientist, a conspiracy theorist, a threat to real archaeology. But here is what they cannot argue with. Hancock has been saying for decades that there was an advanced civilization before the flood, and that a cosmic impact around 10,800 BCE destroyed it. He wrote about it in his book Fingerprints of the Gods back in 1995. The academics laughed at him, called him crazy. Then in 2007, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was published. Suddenly, Hancock did not look so crazy anymore. The cosmic impact he had been talking about turned out to be real. The catastrophic climate change he described turned out to be real. The mass extinction he wrote about turned out to be real. The flooding he claimed reshaped coastlines turned out to be real. And yet, the establishment still will not admit he might be onto something. Why? Because if Hancock is right about the impact, maybe he is right about the civilization too. Maybe there really was an advanced culture living on the coastlines before the floods came. Maybe they really did have knowledge and technology we have not given them credit for. Maybe human history really is older and more sophisticated than we have been taught. The evidence is there. The Younger Dryas impact happened. We have the nanodiamonds. We have the platinum layer. We have the magnetic spherules. We have the megaflood scars. We have the extinction event. We have the ice core data. We have the black mat. All of it points to the same conclusion. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth was struck by fragments of a comet. The impacts triggered climate chaos, megafloods, and mass extinction. Coastal civilizations were wiped out. Humanity barely survived. And every culture on Earth remembers it. They call it the flood. They carved the story into stone. They passed it down through oral tradition. They encoded it in their myths. Because it was not a myth. It was the worst thing that ever happened to our species. And we have spent 12,000 years trying to forget it. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was hiking through the hills of southeastern Turkey when he stumbled across something that would shatter everything we thought we knew about human history. Local farmers had been finding strange stones for years. They assumed it was just an old cemetery. Schmidt took one look and knew immediately. This was something else entirely. He started digging, and what he found should not exist. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill. Not exactly the most dramatic name for what might be the most important archaeological discovery of the last century. Because what Schmidt unearthed was a massive temple complex built with sophisticated architectural knowledge and artistic skill. Enormous limestone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals. Foxes, lions, scorpions, snakes, vultures, and bulls. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. These are not crude scratches made by primitive people. These are detailed, lifelike sculptures that would not look out of place in a modern art museum. But here is the part that breaks the timeline. When Schmidt dated the site, he could not believe the results. So he dated it again and again. Every test came back with the same impossible answer. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9,600 BCE. That is 11,600 years ago. Let me put that in perspective. This temple was already 6,000 years old when the pyramids were built. It was ancient when Stonehenge was constructed. It predates pottery. It predates writing. It predates the wheel. According to everything we have been taught about human development, the people who built this were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers, barely surviving, living in small nomadic bands with no permanent settlements and certainly no capability to organize massive construction projects. Yet here it is, 20 circular structures, each one requiring hundreds of workers, advanced planning, engineering knowledge, and the ability to quarry, transport, and erect stones that weigh as much as a small truck, without metal tools, without draft animals, without any of the technology we assume is necessary for this kind of work. The academic world did not know what to do with Göbekli Tepe. It did not fit. It could not fit. It required rewriting textbooks that had been established for decades. So they did what academics always do when confronted with evidence that challenges the paradigm. They tried to minimize it. They called it an anomaly. They suggested maybe it was not that sophisticated after all. Maybe the dating was wrong. Maybe it was just a ceremonial site built by lucky primitives who somehow pulled off one impressive project before going back to hunting and gathering. Except the problems kept multiplying. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that only 5% of the site has been excavated. There are at least 15 more circular structures buried under the hill, possibly more, each one as sophisticated as the last. This was not a one-time lucky achievement. This was a sustained building program that lasted centuries. Then archaeologists started finding similar sites all over the region: Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori, Hobetsuvan Tepesi, all of them showing the same level of sophistication, all of them dating to the same impossible time period. Suddenly, we are not talking about one anomaly. We are talking about a culture, a civilization that existed at the end of the last ice age, before agriculture, before cities, before everything we thought was necessary for complex society. Now let us talk about Pillar 43. This is where it gets really interesting. One of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe is covered with symbols that researchers have been trying to decode since it was discovered. At the top of the pillar, there is a clear depiction of a scorpion. Below it, a series of abstract symbols. And at the center, a grouping of circular and angular shapes that look almost like a diagram. In 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh published a paper suggesting that Pillar 43 might be an astronomical record, specifically, a record of a cosmic impact. They used software to reconstruct what the night sky would have looked like 11,600 years ago, and they found something remarkable. The symbols on the pillar match the constellations that would have been visible at that exact time. The scorpion represents Scorpius. Other animals represent other star groups, and the central symbols, the circular shapes at the heart of the pillar, could represent a comet or meteor swarm. The researchers propose that Pillar 43 is a memorial, a warning carved in stone to commemorate a catastrophic impact event that the builders witnessed, an event that caused massive destruction and climate change, an event that matches, almost perfectly, the Younger Dryas impact we just talked about. Think about the implications of that. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had advanced astronomical knowledge. They understood the movement of stars. They could track celestial objects. They recorded a comet impact in symbolic form, and they built a massive temple complex to preserve that memory. Why? Because they knew what happened. They survived it. And they wanted to make sure future generations would never forget. Klaus Schmidt believed Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of a catastrophe. Before he died in 2014, he wrote extensively about his theory that the site represents a last gasp of knowledge from a dying civilization. He argued that the people who built these temples were not primitive hunter-gatherers at all. They were the remnants of something far more advanced, something that existed before the Younger Dryas impact, something that was destroyed. And here is the really strange part. Around 8000 BCE, roughly 2,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built, someone deliberately buried the entire site. Not abandoned, buried. They filled in the structures with thousands of tons of dirt and rubble. It was a monumental effort, requiring as much work as building the site in the first place. Why would anyone do that? Why would you spend generations building something extraordinary and then intentionally hide it from the world? Schmidt believed it was protection. The builders knew another catastrophe might be coming. They buried the site to preserve it, to keep the knowledge safe for whoever might dig it up thousands of years later, which is exactly what happened. Göbekli Tepe sat undisturbed for 10,000 years until a German archaeologist with a hunch started digging in the Turkish hills. But mainstream archaeology still resists the obvious conclusion. They admit Göbekli Tepe is older than expected. They admit it is more sophisticated than it should be. They admit it changes our understanding of prehistory, but they refuse to take the next logical step. They refuse to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was a civilization before the flood that we have completely overlooked. Graham Hancock has been shouting about this for years. He points to Göbekli Tepe as proof that his theory is correct. There was an advanced culture at the end of the Ice Age. It was destroyed by the cosmic impact. The survivors scattered across the world, trying to preserve what they knew. And sites like Göbekli Tepe are the fingerprints they left behind. The timeline matches perfectly. Plato wrote about Atlantis, a sophisticated civilization destroyed by floods and earthquakes around 9600 BCE. That is the exact same time Göbekli Tepe was being built. Coincidence? Or is Plato's account, which he claimed came from Egyptian priests, who claimed to have records going back thousands of years, actually describing the same event that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were memorializing? We know coastal areas were devastated by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. Hundreds of miles of coastline disappeared underwater. If there was a pre-flood civilization, they would have built their cities near the ocean, near rivers, in the fertile lowlands that are now submerged. We would not find their cities because they are under 400 feet of water. What we would find are the inland sites, the mountains and highlands where survivors fled, places like Göbekli Tepe. And the evidence keeps mounting. In 2019, archaeologists announced they had found another massive stone complex in Turkey called Bonkuklu Tala. It is even older than Göbekli Tepe. The structures are simpler, which suggests this might be an earlier phase of the same culture, which means the timeline of sophisticated construction in this region keeps getting pushed back further and further. The Turkish government has been oddly restrictive about who gets to excavate these sites. Large portions of Göbekli Tepe remain off-limits to foreign researchers. Why? Some suggest there are political reasons. Turkey wants to control the narrative about its ancient past. Others suggest there are findings that have not been made public, artifacts or structures that are even more controversial than what has already been revealed. Klaus Schmidt hinted at this before he died. He said there were things about Göbekli Tepe that would be very difficult for mainstream archaeology to accept. He never specified what those things were. What we do know is this. 11,600 years ago, someone in southeastern Turkey built a temple complex that should not exist. They built it with knowledge that supposedly did not exist yet. They decorated it with astronomical symbols that recorded a cosmic catastrophe. They used it for centuries, and then they buried it. They preserved it for us to find. They left us a message carved in 20-ton stones. The message says human history is not what you think. Civilization is older than you have been told. We were here. We built this. We survived the catastrophe, and we are warning you, because it could happen again. Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly. It is evidence. Evidence that everything we have been taught about the development of human civilization is incomplete at best, and completely wrong at worst. And that is exactly why the establishment does not want to talk about it. Because once you admit that Göbekli Tepe represents a lost civilization, you have to admit that maybe the flood myths are not myths after all. Göbekli Tepe is not the only structure that refuses to cooperate with the official timeline. All over the world, there are buildings and monuments that should not be where they are, built in ways that should not be possible, showing signs of water damage at elevations where water should never reach. And when you start connecting the dots, a very uncomfortable picture emerges. Let us start underwater. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, divers in 1986 discovered something that looked artificial. Massive stone structures with right angles, flat surfaces, parallel edges, and what appeared to be stairs, terraces, and carved channels. The formation sits about 100 feet below the surface. Marine geologist Masaaki Kimura has spent decades studying it. He is convinced it is man-made. He points to tool marks, post holes, and decorative elements that could not occur naturally. The debate about Yonaguni has raged for 30 years. Skeptics claim it is just unusual geology, that wave action and erosion can create straight lines and flat surfaces. But here is what they cannot explain. If this is natural, why does it look exactly like the ancient stone architecture found on the island above it? The same terracing, the same platforms, the same style. And why do the supposed natural formations align so perfectly with cardinal directions? More importantly, when was Yonaguni above water? Sea levels were low enough for this structure to be exposed on dry land approximately 10,000 years ago, right around the time of the Younger Dryas. Which means if it is artificial, It was built before the flood. Then the waters rose and swallowed it whole. But Yonagwai is not alone. In 2001, marine archaeologists exploring the Gulf of Cambay off the coast of India found what appeared to be an entire city underwater. Sonar images revealed geometric patterns, grid layouts, and massive structures extending over 5 square miles. They recovered artifacts from the site: pottery, beads, pieces of worked wood. When they carbon dated the wood, it came back 9,500 years old. 9,500 years. That predates the Indus Valley civilization by 6,000 years. It predates Mesopotamian cities by 5,000 years. According to official history, there should not be cities anywhere on Earth that old. Yet here is one sitting on the ocean floor off India. The National Institute of Ocean Technology confirmed the findings. Then the story disappeared from mainstream archaeology. Nobody wanted to talk about it because nobody could explain it. Similar underwater structures have been found off the coast of Cuba, in the Mediterranean near Greece, off the coast of England, and near the Bahamas. The Bimini Road, as it is called, is a linear arrangement of stones underwater near the island of Bimini. They are too regular, too uniform, and too well placed to be natural. Edgar Cayce, the famous psychic, predicted in the 1930s that evidence of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in 1968. That is the exact year the structure was discovered. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Cayce tapped into some kind of collective memory about what used to exist there. Now, let us come back on land, to Egypt, the Great Sphinx at Giza. Officially, it was built around 2500 BCE by Pharaoh Khafre. That is what every textbook says. That is what Egyptologists insist. But there is a massive problem that nobody in mainstream archaeology wants to address. The Sphinx shows clear evidence of water erosion. Not wind erosion, water erosion. Deep vertical channels cut into the limestone, the kind that form from heavy rainfall over long periods. Here is the issue. Egypt has been a desert for the last 5,000 years. There has not been enough rainfall to cause that kind of erosion since the African humid period ended around 5,500 BCE. But if you go back further, before the Younger Dryas, Egypt was lush and green. There were lakes, rivers, and regular monsoon rains. The climate was completely different. Geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx in the early 1990s. He is not some fringe researcher. He has a PhD from Yale and is a professor at Boston University. His specialty is rock weathering and erosion. He looked at the Sphinx and immediately knew something was wrong. The erosion patterns did not match the timeline. He consulted with other geologists. They agreed. Based purely on the weathering, the Sphinx had to be far older than Egyptology claimed. Schoch proposed a date of 7,000 to 9,000 BCE at minimum, possibly older. The Egyptology establishment went ballistic. Zahi Hawass, the former head of Egyptian antiquities, called Schoch an amateur and a fraud. He said geologists have no business dating archaeological sites. Never mind that geology is literally the science of dating rocks and determining when they were exposed to different environmental conditions. Schoch was viciously attacked in academic journals, denied access to sites, and labelled a pseudoscientist for suggesting the Sphinx might be older than officially claimed. But Schoch stood his ground. He published his findings in peer-reviewed journals. Other geologists examined the evidence and supported his conclusions. The weathering patterns are consistent with sustained rainfall. The Sphinx enclosure shows the same water erosion. Even the surrounding temples show it. And none of it matches the arid conditions that have existed in Egypt for the last 5,000 years. So either Egyptology is right and somehow wind erosion in a desert created weathering patterns identical to water erosion, or Schoch is right and the Sphinx is thousands of years older than we have been told. One of these explanations requires ignoring basic geology. The other requires rewriting history. Guess which one the establishment prefers. Let us go to South America. Pumapunku in Bolivia. This site is part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, which officially dates to around 500 CE. But Pumapunku shows construction techniques that are absolutely baffling. The stones are cut with machine-like precision, perfect right angles, smooth surfaces, interlocking blocks with tolerances measured in millimeters. Some of the cuts could only be made with diamond-tipped tools or high-speed machinery. The stones themselves are andesite and diorite, some of the hardest rocks on Earth. Copper chisels, which is what the Tiwanaku people supposedly used, cannot cut these stones. They are not hard enough. Engineer Christopher Dunn has analysed the precision of the cuts at Puma Punku. He specialises in machining and manufacturing. He says the level of accuracy in these stones matches modern CNC milling, not ancient hand tools. The surfaces are flat to within thousandths of an inch. The angles are perfect. The drill holes are uniform and precise. If you tried to replicate this work today with copper tools, you could not do it. Even with modern steel tools, it would be incredibly difficult. And here is another mystery. Some of these stones weigh over 100 tons. The nearest quarry is 10 miles away across a lake. How did they transport blocks that heavy without wheels, without animals strong enough to pull that weight, and across water? The official explanation is they used reed boats and log rollers. Except engineers have tried to replicate this. It does not work. The boats sink. The rollers break. The stones are too heavy. Or look at the Osirian at Abydos in Egypt. This is a temple that sits right next to the Temple of Seti I, which dates to around 1300 BCE. The Osirian uses completely different construction. Massive limestone and granite blocks weighing up to 100 tons each, fitted together without mortar. The architectural style does not match anything else from the New Kingdom period. It looks more like the Valley Temple next to the Sphinx, which Egyptologists also date to 2500 BCE, but which shows the same water erosion problems. The Osirian sits 40 feet below the current ground level. It has been flooded with groundwater for most of its existence. The walls show water damage extending far above the current water table, suggesting it was subjected to much higher water levels in the past. Some researchers believe it predates the Temple of Seti by thousands of years and was simply discovered and repurposed by later Egyptians who built their temple next to it. Then there is Nan Madol in Micronesia, an ancient city built on artificial islands, constructed from massive basalt columns stacked like logs to form walls and structures. It covers 11 square miles. The basalt had to be quarried from a different island and transported by sea. Some of the stones weigh 25 tons. The city is estimated to have been built around 1000 CE, but local legends say it is much older, built by twin sorcerers using magic to levitate the stones into place. When you visit these sites, when you stand in front of these impossible structures, you cannot escape the feeling that we are missing something fundamental about our past. These are not primitive constructions. These are engineered works that required advanced planning, sophisticated mathematics, precision tools, and organizational capabilities that supposedly did not exist, and so many of them show water damage. The Sphinx, the Osirian, structures in the Andes at elevations of 13,000 feet with evidence of ancient shorelines. How does water reach that high unless there was a catastrophic flood, or unless these structures were built when sea levels were dramatically different? The establishment explanation is always the same. Ancient people were smarter than we give them credit for. They had patience. They had time. They used simple tools and brute force. But that explanation is starting to wear thin, because we keep finding structures that push the boundaries of what simple tools and patience can accomplish. We keep finding evidence that does not fit the timeline, and we keep running into academic resistance every time someone suggests maybe, just maybe, we need to reconsider what we think we know about ancient engineering capabilities. These antediluvian structures are not scattered randomly. They cluster around coastal areas that would have been prime real estate before the flood. They show construction techniques that appear and disappear without a clear line of technological development. And they carry the scars of water damage that should not be there unless something catastrophic happened. Something that matches exactly what the myths describe and exactly what the geological record confirms. A global flood that destroyed whatever civilization created these monuments, leaving behind only the most massive and durable structures as proof they ever existed at all. After the waters receded, after the ice stopped melting, after the ash settled and the world stopped shaking, there were survivors. They wandered through a landscape that had been completely transformed. Coastlines had moved hundreds of miles. Entire regions were submerged. The climate was different. The animals were gone. Most of humanity had perished. but some made it through. And according to myths from every corner of the planet, these survivors were not alone. They had help. Teachers arrived, mysterious figures who came from somewhere else, bringing knowledge that allowed civilization to restart. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, 7 sages who existed before the Great Flood. They are depicted in carvings as strange hybrid beings, sometimes with the bodies of fish and the heads of men, sometimes as bird-headed humanoids, sometimes as bearded figures, wearing what look like wristwatches and carrying mysterious handbags. The text described them as wise beyond measure, possessing knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, and law. They appeared during the reign of the Antediluvian kings, those impossibly long-lived rulers who supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood came and reset everything. After the deluge, according to Sumerian tradition, the Apkallu returned. They taught the survivors how to rebuild, how to plant crops, how to construct cities, how to organize society. Then they disappeared. Where they came from, where they went, the texts do not say. They simply existed before, helped after, and then vanished from history. In Egypt, there is a parallel tradition, the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. Egyptian priest historians told Greek visitors about a time before the pharaohs, a first time called Zep Tepi, when gods walked among men and great works were accomplished. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus, describe this earlier epoch in detail. They speak of beings who came from an island that was destroyed, who possessed the knowledge of the primeval age, and who set about recreating what had been lost. They built the first temples. They established the sacred geometry. They encoded astronomical knowledge into stone. Then, like the Apkallu, they faded into mythology. The Turin Papyrus, also called the Turin King List, records Egyptian rulers going back thousands of years before the first dynasty. It includes the reigns of gods and demigods who ruled for centuries. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses this as mythological fiction. But what if it is not fiction? What if it is a garbled historical record of real people who lived such radically different lives that later cultures could only explain them as gods? Cross the Atlantic to South America. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, a pale-skinned, bearded figure who arrived after a great flood had destroyed the previous world. He traveled across the land teaching agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. He appeared at Tiwanaku, that same site with the impossibly precise stonework at Pumapunku, and according to legend, he either built it or instructed others how to build it. Then he walked across the landscape, civilizing tribes, establishing order, and performing miracles. When his work was done, he walked into the ocean and disappeared. The Maya and Aztecs had their own version, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, Kukulkan, same entity, different names, a bearded teacher who came from across the eastern sea. He taught the people writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture. He established the calendar systems that tracked Venus cycles and eclipse patterns with shocking accuracy. He built pyramids aligned to celestial events. Then he promised to return one day and sailed away. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, some indigenous people believed they were witnessing Quetzalcoatl's prophesied return, a tragic misidentification that helped doom their civilization. The pattern repeats across the Pacific. In Polynesia, the god Maui is credited with bringing fire, teaching navigation, and showing humans how to fish. In Micronesia, legends speak of Olophat, who descended from the sky and taught practical skills. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the sky heroes, or Wandjina, came during the dream time and taught law, ceremony, and survival skills. They are depicted in ancient rock art as large-eyed beings with halos, looking almost extraterrestrial. The art is tens of thousands of years old. Even in Mesopotamia beyond the Sumerians, the Babylonians remembered Oannes, a being who emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf. He had the body of a fish, but underneath was a man. During the day he taught humans writing, science, arts, and architecture. At night he returned to the sea. This continued for years until humans had learned enough to sustain themselves. Then Oannes departed and never returned. The historian Berossus recorded this story in the 3rd century BCE. but he claimed to be preserving much older Chaldean records from Babylonian temple archives. Who were these figures? Why do cultures separated by oceans describe the same archetype? A wise teacher, often pale or unusual in appearance, arriving after catastrophe, bringing advanced knowledge, then disappearing. The mainstream explanation is Carl Jung's theory of archetypes, universal symbols that emerge independently in every culture because of shared human psychology. The wise old man, the teacher, the culture hero. It is all just mythological pattern-making, they say. Humans create these stories because we need them psychologically. But that explanation feels insufficient when you look at the specifics. These are not vague wise men. They bring specific knowledge: astronomy, agriculture, architecture, mathematics, law, and they bring it to cultures that supposedly had no prior contact with civilization. Hunter-gatherers who suddenly, within a few generations, develop writing systems, build cities, create complex calendars, and establish sophisticated religious hierarchies. This is not gradual cultural evolution. This is a knowledge transfer. Graham Hancock proposes a controversial but logical explanation. What if these teachers were real people? Survivors from a pre-flood civilization that possessed advanced knowledge. When the cataclysm destroyed their world, small groups escaped. They had boats. They had navigational skills. They knew the catastrophe was coming, or at least some of them did, and they prepared. After the waters receded, they set out to preserve what they could of their culture. They traveled to different regions where pockets of humanity survived. They shared their knowledge. They helped jumpstart civilization in multiple locations. Then, over generations, they died out or integrated into local populations, and their true origins were forgotten. What remained were garbled legends about gods and fishmen and bearded sages who came from the sea. This would explain the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in multiple locations simultaneously. Around 10,000 BCE, agriculture appears independently in at least 7 different regions across the world: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, New Guinea, West Africa, Egypt. In each location it happens rapidly. Humans go from pure hunting and gathering to domesticating plants and animals within a few centuries. This is often called the Neolithic Revolution, but the term revolution is misleading. It suggests rapid change, but natural cultural evolution does not work that fast. Something accelerated the process. What if that something was knowledge brought by survivors who understood agriculture because their pre-flood civilization had already developed it? The same pattern appears with astronomy. Suddenly, cultures around the world are tracking precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 25,772 years to complete one full cycle. To even notice precession, you need to observe the stars for centuries and compare your observations with records from previous generations. Yet multiple ancient cultures knew about it. The Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Maya, the Vedic astronomers of India. How did Stone Age humans independently discover something that requires sophisticated long-term astronomical observation? Unless they did not discover it independently, unless someone taught them, someone who already knew because their civilization had been tracking the stars for thousands of years before the flood. Then there is the mystery of the giants. Nearly every ancient culture has legends of giant humans who lived before the flood. The Bible mentions the Nephilim, giants who walked the earth before the deluge. Greek mythology is filled with titans and giants. Norse legends speak of Jotnar, the giant race that existed before the gods. Hindu texts describe Daityas, massive beings from an earlier age. Native American tribes across North and South America have giant legends. The Paiutes speak of red-haired giants who were eventually hunted to extinction. The Iroquois tell of a race of giants who built the ancient earthworks. In the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers across America regularly reported discoveries of giant skeletons, 7 feet, 8 feet. Some accounts claim 10 feet or more. These reports came from credible sources: archaeologists, Smithsonian researchers, university professors. Yet today, none of these skeletons can be found. The Smithsonian Institution is accused by many researchers of having collected and then destroyed or hidden these remains. Why? Because they do not fit the narrative. Because if there really were giants, if there really was a population of unusually large humans before the flood, then the myths are not myths. They are history. Modern science has discovered something interesting. There were multiple human species coexisting on Earth until very recently. Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. We interbred with Denisovans. Genetic testing proves this. We carry their DNA. Denisovans in particular are fascinating. We have only a few fragments of their bones, but genetic analysis reveals they were large, robust, and had adaptations for high-altitude living. They existed in Asia until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly much later. What if some populations of Denisovans or other archaic humans survived longer than we think? What if the giant legends are folk memories of encounters with these larger, older human relatives? And what if some of these beings possessed knowledge? What if there were populations of archaic humans or even early Homo sapiens who developed advanced understanding of astronomy, architecture, and agriculture before the flood? And when disaster struck, a few survived to pass on what they knew to the scattered bands of survivors they encountered. Hey, real quick, if you are still watching, I want to say thank you. This stuff is not easy to talk about. It challenges everything we have been taught, and I know that can be uncomfortable. But that is exactly why we are here, to ask the questions nobody else will ask. So if you are finding value in this, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button if you have not already. This channel exists because people like you want to dig deeper into the mysteries of our past, and there is so much more coming. Trust me, we are just getting started. The survivors brought knowledge. The myths say it. The archaeological evidence suggests it. And the sudden appearance of advanced civilization in multiple locations at roughly the same time period supports it. Something or someone jump-started humanity after the catastrophe. Teachers came. They shared what they knew. They helped us rebuild, and then they disappeared into the fog of prehistory, leaving behind only legends and questions we are only now beginning to answer. The ancients were obsessed with the sky. Every major civilization devoted enormous resources to tracking celestial movements. They built massive structures aligned to stars, planets, and seasonal markers. They developed complex calendars that tracked cycles spanning thousands of years. They encoded astronomical data into mythology and architecture. Why? The standard explanation is religion. They worshipped the sun and moon and stars, so they built temples to honor them. But what if there was a more practical reason? What if they were building a warning system? Start with the Great Pyramid of Giza. Everyone knows it. It is the most famous ancient structure on Earth. Egyptologists insist it was built as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu, around 2550 BCE. Yet not a single hieroglyph appears inside the pyramid itself. No inscriptions, no decorations, nothing identifying it as a tomb. No mummy was ever found there. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber has no lid and shows no evidence of ever having one. For a tomb, it is remarkably untomb-like. But as an astronomical instrument, that is where it gets interesting. The pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree. That is more precise than the Royal Observatory in Greenwich was when it was built in 1675. The four sides are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. The slope angle of 51 degrees and 51 minutes creates a structure whose height relates to its base perimeter in the exact same ratio as a circle's radius relates to its circumference. It is pi encoded in stone. The internal shafts that extend from the king's chamber and queen's chamber were long thought to be air shafts, but they are too narrow and were originally sealed. In the 1960s, astronomer Virginia Trimble calculated where these shafts pointed when the pyramid was built. The southern shaft from the king's chamber aimed directly at Orion's belt. The northern shaft pointed at the pole star of that era, Thuban in the constellation Draco. The shafts from the Queen's chamber aligned with Sirius and Beta Ursa Minor. Robert Bovell took this further. He noticed that the three pyramids at Giza match the pattern of the three stars in Orion's belt, not just roughly, precisely. The smaller pyramid is offset from the line of the other two by the exact amount that the smallest star in the belt is offset from its companions. But here is the key detail. The alignment is perfect for how Orion looked around 10,500 BCE, not 2,500 BCE when Egyptologists say the pyramids were built. 10,500 BCE, right around the end of the Younger Dryas, right around the time of the flood. Bauval's Orion correlation theory caused an uproar. Egyptologists attacked it viciously. They said he was cherry-picking data. They said the alignment was coincidental. They said he was promoting pseudoscience. But other researchers checked his math. The alignment is real. The pyramids do match Orion as it appeared 12,500 years ago. Either that is an impossible coincidence, or the pyramids were designed to commemorate a date far older than mainstream archaeology is willing to accept. Now travel to Cambodia. Angkor Wat, the largest religious structure ever built, covers over 400 acres. It is astronomically aligned with extreme precision. The main axis points to the spring equinox sunrise. The causeway measures 1,472 cubits, which matches the length of 1/4 of a precessional cycle in years. But researchers have found something even more remarkable. The layout of Angkor Wat and the surrounding temples matches the constellation Draco as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. Again, the same date, the same time period marked at Giza. Halfway around the world at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, the Kalasasaya platform is aligned to track the equinoxes and solstices, but the alignment is off from current celestial positions. Engineers have calculated that the alignment was accurate around 9,500 BCE. The structure was either built then, or it was built later to commemorate that specific date. Why would anyone memorialize a date from thousands of years before they lived, unless something significant happened then? Stonehenge, Newgrange, Karnak. Everywhere you look, ancient people were building massive stone monuments aligned to celestial events. Not just the sun and moon, specific stars, specific constellations, specific cycles. The effort involved was enormous. Stonehenge's bluestones were transported over 150 miles from Wales. The sarsen stones, some weighing 25 tons, were dragged 20 miles. Why go to such extreme effort just to mark a summer solstice? Unless there was a deeper purpose. Here is a provocative idea. What if these monuments were not temples or tombs at all? What if they were astronomical computers? What if they were designed to track cosmic threats? In 1901, sponge divers off the coast of Antikythera, Greece, discovered a shipwreck containing a corroded bronze mechanism. When researchers finally examined it decades later using X-ray technology, they were stunned. It was a complex analog computer with dozens of interlocking gears. It calculated astronomical positions and predicted eclipses. It tracked the cycles of the sun, moon, and planets. It even accounted for the irregular orbit of the moon. This device is over 2,000 years old. It is more sophisticated than anything else we have from that era by 1,000 years. Nothing even close to its complexity appears again until medieval clockwork. The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient people were capable of building incredibly sophisticated astronomical instruments. If they could build that 2,000 years ago, what could they have built 10,000 years ago? What knowledge might have existed before the flood that we have lost? The Mayans tracked Venus cycles with obsessive precision. Their calendar systems calculated planetary positions thousands of years into the future and past. They knew the exact length of the solar year to 3 decimal places. They understood precession. They marked the end of great cycles. Their long count calendar, famously reset in 2012, which caused worldwide panic about apocalyptic predictions. Nothing happened, of course. But the fact remains that the Maya were tracking cycles spanning 5,125 years, multiple iterations adding up to 26,000 years, the full precessional cycle. Why? What were they watching for? Vedic texts from India describe yugas, cosmic ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years. They describe cycles of creation and destruction. They talk about periodic catastrophes that wipe out civilizations. The Puranas contain detailed astronomical information, including the precession of the equinoxes, recorded thousands of years before Western science supposedly discovered it. The ancient Indians were tracking cosmic time on scales that dwarf human lifespans. The The Dogon tribe of Mali has knowledge they should not possess. French anthropologists in the 1930s recorded Dogon traditions about Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. The Dogon claimed Sirius had a companion star that was invisible to the naked eye but incredibly dense. They said it orbited Sirius every 50 years. They were describing Sirius B, a white dwarf star that was not discovered by Western astronomy until 1862 and not photographed until 1970. It is completely invisible without a telescope. The Dogon also knew that Jupiter has moons and that Saturn has rings. How? They claim their ancestors were taught by visitors from the Sirius system called the Nommo, amphibious beings who came from the sky. Another group of mysterious teachers bringing astronomical knowledge. All across the ancient world, people were watching the sky with a level of sophistication that seems absurd for Stone Age cultures. They were not just tracking the sun for planting seasons. They were mapping the entire celestial sphere. They were calculating cycles that take millennia to complete. They were recording the positions of stars with precision that required generations of continuous observation. And they were leaving messages. Graham Hancock calls it the knowledge of the gods. He argues that survivors of the pre-flood civilization encoded critical information into monuments and myths, hoping future generations would be smart enough to decode it. The monuments are time capsules. The myths are mnemonics. The astronomical alignments are pointing to a specific date, 10,500 BCE, the time when everything changed. What were they warning us about? The possibility that it could happen again. If a comet strike caused the Younger Dryas, if fragments of a massive object slammed into Earth 12,800 years ago, then the debris field from that object might still be out there, and Earth might pass through it again. Precession means the Earth slowly wobbles on its axis, changing which stars appear where over long periods. But it also means that Earth's position in space relative to comet streams and asteroid belts changes. A comet swarm that posed no threat 10,000 years ago might be directly in our path now, or in the future. Ancient people understood cycles. They understood that what happened before could happen again. So they built monuments that would survive any catastrophe. They made them massive so they could not be moved or destroyed. They aligned them to the sky so future astronomers would eventually understand the message. They were saying, look up, pay attention, track what is out there, because it is not over. Modern astronomers are starting to listen. We now actively track near-Earth objects. We map asteroids and comets that could pose impact threats. We have plans, theoretical at least, for deflecting incoming objects. But we are also discovering how many close calls we have had. Objects passing between Earth and the Moon. Asteroids detected only days before they whizzed past us. The Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013 that exploded over Russia, injuring over 1,000 people, was not detected until it was already in the atmosphere. The ancients built their warning system in stone because they knew. They survived one catastrophe. They did not want future humans to be caught unprepared for the next one. The pyramids, the temples, the stone circles, they are all pointing up, telling us to watch the sky, telling us to remember, telling us that the cosmos is not a peaceful place and that Earth is not safe. It never has been. And unless we pay attention to the warnings carved into our most ancient monuments, we might not be ready when the next disaster comes. Academia has a dirty little secret. It does not actually want the truth. It wants consensus. It wants predictability. It wants everyone to stay inside the lines of accepted theory. And when someone presents evidence that challenges the established narrative, the response is not curiosity. It is hostility. This is not paranoia. This is documented pattern. We can trace it through decades of archaeological and geological controversy. The same scenario plays out over and over. A researcher discovers something that does not fit. They publish their findings. The establishment attacks. Funding disappears. Access to sites gets revoked. Reputations are destroyed. The evidence gets buried, sometimes literally, and the official story remains unchanged. Take the case of Virginia Steen McIntyre. In the 1970s, she was a respected geologist working in Mexico at a site called Hueyatlaco. She was brought in specifically for her expertise in dating volcanic ash layers. Her job was straightforward. Determine how old the archaeological site was. She used multiple dating methods: uranium series dating, tetrahydration, fission track dating. All of them pointed to the same conclusion. The site was 250,000 years old. There was just one problem. The site contained advanced stone tools, blades, scrapers, projectile points. According to accepted theory, humans did not arrive in the Americas until maybe 15,000 years ago at the earliest. 250,000 years was impossible. It would mean humans, or pre-humans, with sophisticated tool-making ability were in Mexico. At the same time, Neanderthals were still living in Europe. It shattered the timeline. Steen McIntyre reported her findings, and her career ended. The lead archaeologist on the project refused to publish the dates. He accused her of making errors. When she insisted her methodology was sound, she was removed from the project. Her paper was rejected by multiple journals. She was blacklisted from fieldwork. She could not get funding. She could not get published. Her academic career was effectively over because she reported data that contradicted established theory. The site of Huayatlaco is now closed to research. The artifacts sit in storage, and the official narrative remains that humans arrived in the Americas no earlier than 15,000 years ago. Or look at what happened to John Anthony West. He was an independent Egyptologist who worked with Robert Schoch on the water erosion evidence at the Sphinx. West spent years researching Egyptian civilization. He produced documentaries. He wrote books. He led tours. He knew the sites as well as any credentialed archaeologist. When he and Schoch presented their evidence that the Sphinx showed rainfall erosion inconsistent with the current timeline, Zahi Hawass led the charge against them. Hawass was the Secretary General of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities for years. He controlled access to every major site in Egypt. He decided who could excavate, who could study artifacts, who could even enter restricted areas, and he used that power ruthlessly. He called West and Schoch charlatans. He banned them from sites. He refused to engage with their evidence. He appeared in documentaries specifically to discredit them. When pressed on the geological evidence, his response was essentially that geologists should stay out of archaeology. The erosion was caused by wind and sand, he insisted, despite multiple geologists explaining that wind and sand do not create vertical channels. Hawass represents a broader problem. Archaeology in Egypt is not just about science, it is about national pride, tourism, revenue, and religious sensitivities. The Egyptian government has a vested interest in maintaining the narrative that Egyptian civilization arose independently, that the pharaohs were the pinnacle of ancient achievement, and that nothing predates the dynastic periods. Any suggestion of a pre-pharaonic advanced civilization threatens that narrative, so it gets suppressed. The same dynamic exists everywhere. In Mexico, access to ancient sites is tightly controlled. In Turkey, large portions of Göbekli Tepe remain off-limits to foreign researchers. In Peru, the government restricts who can study Machu Picchu and other Incan sites. Access equals control. Control equals narrative management. Then there is the Smithsonian controversy. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers across America reported discoveries of giant skeletons, unusual artifacts, and anomalous remains that did not fit the accepted model of Native American prehistory. Many of these discoveries were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study. Yet today, none of these artifacts can be found in the Smithsonian's collections. They have disappeared. Researchers have filed Freedom of Information Act requests trying to locate these items. The Smithsonian claims they never existed, or were lost or misidentified. But the volume of reports is staggering. Hundreds of newspaper accounts, detailed descriptions, measurements, photographs in some cases, all gone. Conspiracy theorists claim the Smithsonian deliberately destroyed evidence that contradicted the narrative. The Smithsonian denies this, but they cannot produce the artifacts, and they cannot explain why so many documented discoveries have vanished without a trace. The academic funding structure makes dissent nearly impossible. To get research grants, you need to propose projects that peer reviewers will approve. Peer reviewers are established scholars who have built their careers on existing paradigms. If you propose research that challenges those paradigms, you will not get funded. It is that simple. No funding means no research. No research means no publications. No publications means no tenure. No tenure means no career. The system is designed to perpetuate itself. This is why Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, Robert Schoch, and others operate outside the traditional academic structure. Hancock is a journalist. Carlson is an independent researcher. They do not need university approval. They do not need grant money from institutions that demand ideological compliance. They can follow evidence wherever it leads, without fear of losing tenure or funding. And that terrifies the establishment because they cannot be controlled. The attacks on these researchers are personal and vicious. They are called pseudoscientists, frauds, conspiracy theorists, dangerous. The label pseudoscience is particularly insidious because it is used to dismiss evidence without actually engaging with it. You do not have to refute someone's data if you can successfully label them as not real scientists. Ad hominem attacks replace academic debate. When Joe Rogan hosted Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson on his podcast, the episodes went viral. Millions of people heard alternative theories about human prehistory, the Younger Dryas impact, and lost civilizations. The response from the archaeological community was immediate and furious. Articles appeared in academic publications condemning Rogan for platforming pseudoscience. They did not engage with the evidence Hancock and Carlson presented. They simply demanded that such ideas not be given a platform at all. That is not science. That is orthodoxy. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a perfect case study in institutional resistance. When it was first proposed in 2007, it was ridiculed. Established geologists who had built careers on gradualist theories attacked it mercilessly. They said there was no evidence. When evidence was presented, they said it was misinterpreted. When more evidence accumulated, they said it was still not enough. The goalposts kept moving. But something interesting happened. Younger researchers, ones without decades of investment in the old paradigm, started testing the hypothesis. And they kept finding supporting evidence. The nanodiamonds, the platinum anomaly, the magnetic spherules, the impact proxies. Study after study confirmed that something extraordinary happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. By 2018, the weight of evidence had become overwhelming. Mainstream journals that had previously rejected impact-related papers started publishing them. The hypothesis went from fringe to plausible to increasingly accepted. But it took over a decade of bitter fighting. Why the resistance? Because accepting the impact means accepting catastrophism, and catastrophism was supposed to be dead. It was defeated in the 1800s when uniformitarianism became the dominant geological paradigm. Charles Lyell convinced the scientific world that Earth's features were shaped by slow processes over vast time periods. Not catastrophes, not floods, not impacts. Just gradual change. This became dogma. Textbooks were written. Careers were built. Departments were structured around this principle. Admitting that a cosmic impact nearly ended human civilization 12,000 years ago means admitting that Lyell was wrong. That catastrophes do shape Earth's history. That gradualism is not always the answer. And if Lyell was wrong about that, what else might he have been wrong about? The entire geological timeline becomes questionable, which means the archaeological timeline built on top of it becomes questionable, which means history textbooks need to be rewritten, which means professors need to admit they have been teaching incorrect information for decades. No one wants to do that. It is easier to dismiss the evidence, to attack the researchers, to protect the paradigm, even if it means ignoring reality. But reality has a way of asserting itself. The evidence keeps accumulating. The anomalies keep appearing. The structures that should not exist keep being discovered. And more people are asking questions. The internet has broken the academic monopoly on information. You do not need a PhD to read research papers. You do not need institutional approval to examine evidence. The gatekeepers are losing control, and they are terrified. Because once people start questioning the timeline of human civilization, once they start looking at the evidence for themselves, once they realize how much has been suppressed or ignored or dismissed, the entire edifice of establishment archaeology starts to crumble. And that is exactly what is happening. The cover-up is failing. The truth is too big. and it is only a matter of time before the official story collapses under the weight of evidence it can no longer ignore. The ancient warnings were not just about what happened, they were about what could happen again. And there is growing evidence that the threat which nearly destroyed humanity 12,000 years ago is still out there, circling through space, waiting for Earth to pass through its path once more. Meet the Taurid meteor stream. Twice a year, in late June and early July, and again in late October and early November, Earth passes through a massive debris field left behind by a disintegrating comet. Most years, we see nothing more than a few pretty shooting stars. But astronomers have discovered something disturbing. The Taurid stream is not uniform. It contains dense clusters of material, including fragments large enough to cause serious damage if they hit us. And we are heading into a period when those dense clusters will be directly in Earth's path. The parent body of the Taurid stream is Comet Encke, a short-period comet that orbits the Sun every 3.3 years. But Encke is just a remnant. It is what is left of something much larger. Astronomers believe that roughly 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, a giant comet entered the inner solar system and began breaking apart. Over millennia, it fragmented into dozens or hundreds of pieces, creating a debris field that stretches across millions of miles of space. Comet Encke is the largest surviving fragment, but there are others. Some of these fragments are enormous. In 1983, astronomers discovered an object in the Taurid stream estimated to be between 20 and 30 kilometers across. That is larger than the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. They lost track of it, could not find it again. Somewhere in the Taurid stream, there is a mountain-sized object we know exists but cannot currently locate. Sleep well tonight. Here is where it gets more specific. Astronomers Victor Klube and Bill Napier have spent decades studying the Taurid stream. They have identified what they call coherent catastrophism, the idea that Earth periodically encounters dense regions of the Taurid debris field, and when we do, impact events spike dramatically. They have mapped out a cycle. Roughly every 3,000 years, Earth passes through the thickest part of the stream, and every time we do, civilizations collapse. Not because of one single impact, but because of multiple strikes over a period of decades or centuries, destabilizing climate, destroying crops, triggering social breakdown. They point to evidence throughout history. Around 2200 BCE, multiple civilizations collapsed simultaneously. The Old Kingdom of Egypt fell. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia disappeared. Cities across the Middle East were abandoned. Climate records show a sudden cooling event. Drought. Famine. Researchers have found a layer of ash and burned material dating to this period across a wide geographic area. Klube and Napier argue this was a Taurid encounter. Multiple impacts or airbursts causing widespread destruction. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapsed. Advanced civilizations around the Mediterranean and Near East disintegrated within a few decades. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptian New Kingdom barely survived. Cities burned. Trade routes collapsed. Writing systems disappeared. This period is one of the great mysteries of archaeology. No one knows exactly what caused such widespread simultaneous collapse. Klube and Napier point to the Taurids again, and there is evidence. Burned layers, impact proxies, climate disruption, and of course, 10,800 BCE, the Younger Dryas impact, the big one, the catastrophe that nearly ended humanity. That was a Taurid encounter. The fragments that struck Earth came from the same debris field we pass through every year. Now here is the concerning part. We are entering another peak period. Between 2000 and 2040, Earth will pass through a denser than normal section of the Taurid stream. Klube and Napier have been warning about this for years. Other astronomers have confirmed the calculations. We are moving into a danger zone. You might think governments would take this seriously. You might think there would be international efforts to track every object in the Taurid stream, to prepare impact mitigation strategies, to warn the public, but there is almost complete silence. NASA tracks near-Earth objects, yes, but the Taurid stream is not treated as a priority threat. Why? Some researchers believe it is deliberate. Governments know the risk, but do not want to cause panic. What would happen if world leaders announced that Earth is about to pass through a debris field containing mountain-sized objects, and that we have no way to stop them if they are on a collision course? Markets would crash. Social order would break down. So they say nothing. They track what they can. They hope for the best. And they keep the public in the dark. But we have already had close calls. On June 30th, 1908, something exploded over Tunguska, Siberia. The blast was equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. It flattened 800 square miles of forest. If it had hit 6 hours later, due to Earth's rotation, it would have struck St. Petersburg, killing millions. What was it? Most likely a fragment from the Taurid stream. The explosion occurred during the June Taurid meteor shower. The object came from the right direction. It fits the profile perfectly. On February 15th, 2013, a meteor exploded over Chelyabinsk, Russia. The shockwave blew out windows across the region and injured over 1,000 people. Again, this happened during a Taurid activity period. The object was estimated at 60 feet across. Not huge by cosmic standards, but big enough to cause significant damage. And we did not see it coming. It approached from the direction of the sun, so telescopes could not spot it. We had zero warning. These are not hypothetical threats. These are recent events. Objects from the Taurid stream hitting Earth and causing destruction. Now, imagine something 10 times larger, 100 times larger. That is what sits in the stream, waiting for Earth to pass through the wrong spot at the wrong time. Ancient civilizations knew about this. The Egyptians tracked the cycles. The Mayans calculated the dangerous periods. The Sumerians recorded previous impacts. They encoded warnings into their temples and texts. They were telling us to watch the sky, to remember the cycles, to prepare, because they knew it happens over and over. The destroyer returns. Hopi prophecies speak of the blue kachina, a celestial object that will appear in the sky signaling a time of purification and destruction. The elders say when the blue kachina makes its appearance, the fifth world will emerge after a period of great tribulation. They describe it as a blue star. Comets often appear bluish. Is this prophecy a folk memory of previous Taurid encounters, passed down through generations, warning of the return? The Book of Revelation describes stars falling from heaven, mountains burning, a third of the earth being scorched. Ancient Hindu texts describe the Kali Yuga ending in fire from the sky. Norse mythology predicts Ragnarok, when the heavens will split and fire will consume the world. Are these religious visions, or are they descriptions of impact events encoded in mythological language? Modern governments are not completely ignoring the threat. They are building bunkers, seed vaults, underground facilities designed to preserve knowledge and genetic material. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway stores seeds from every major crop on Earth, buried deep in permafrost, designed to survive any catastrophe. Why? Officially, it is for agricultural preservation, but it is also a backup plan. If something wipes out surface agriculture, survivors can restart from the vault. Military installations have been moved underground. NORAD operates from inside Cheyenne Mountain. Elite continuity of government facilities exist that the public is not allowed to know about. Massive tunnel systems have been constructed under major cities. Are these just Cold War relics? Or are they preparation for something else? Operation Deep Freeze, the US military presence in Antarctica, officially exists for scientific research, but the scale of the operation seems disproportionate. Large transport planes flying in equipment, restricted zones where civilians cannot go. What are they preparing for? Some researchers believe Antarctica is seen as a refuge location. If impacts strike the northern hemisphere, Antarctica might be shielded. The ice shelves could protect against tsunamis. It is isolated. It could survive when other continents burn. This is not conspiracy rambling. This is basic risk assessment. If you were a government leader, and you knew there was even a small chance of catastrophic impacts over the next few decades, what would you do? You would quietly prepare. You would build shelters for essential personnel. You would stockpile food and technology. You would create backup systems. And you would not tell the general public because causing mass panic serves no purpose if there is nothing individuals can do to protect themselves. But the ancients gave us a different message. They said knowledge is protection, They said awareness is survival. They built their monuments to last because they wanted future generations to understand the danger. They encoded the cycles so we would know when to watch the sky. They were not trying to cause panic. They were trying to give us a chance. The Taurid stream is real. The debris field is there. The dangerous fragments exist. And we are moving into the zone where encounters become more likely. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe we will pass through cleanly and the threat will fade for another few thousand years. Or maybe, on some random night in the next decade or two, the sky will light up. And we will understand, in the last moments before impact, why every ancient civilization told the same story about fire from heaven and the world being destroyed. Because they were not myths, they were memories. And memories have a way of becoming reality again when the cycle's complete. Forget the myths for a moment. Forget the ancient texts and the astronomical alignments and the mysterious teachers. Let us talk about something that cannot be argued with. Rocks, dirt, physical evidence carved into the landscape that tells a story mainstream geology has tried very hard to ignore. Walk through the Himalayas at 20,000 feet above sea level. You will find fossilized seashells embedded in the rock. Ammonites, marine organisms that lived in ocean water. Somehow, they ended up 5 miles above current sea level. The standard explanation is plate tectonics. India crashed into Asia, pushing seafloor upward over millions of years. Fair enough. Except these fossils show signs of rapid burial, not gradual geological uplift. They are preserved with soft tissue impressions. That does not happen over millions of years. That happens when something buries them fast. The same phenomenon appears in the Rockies, in the Andes, on mountain peaks across the world. Marine fossils where water should never have reached. Yes, tectonic forces raise mountains, but the distribution and condition of these fossils suggests something more violent, something that moved enormous volumes of water rapidly across continents, carrying marine life far inland and depositing it at impossible elevations before the water drained away. Now look at sediment layers. Geologists drill core samples and find distinct strata, each supposedly representing millions of years of slow deposition. But there are anomalies everywhere. Polystrate fossils. These are fossilized trees that extend vertically through multiple rock layers. A single tree trunk passing through sediment that supposedly took millions of years to form. How does a tree stand upright for millions of years while sediment slowly accumulates around it? It does not. Trees rot, they fall, they decompose. The only way a polystrate fossil forms is if the sediment was deposited rapidly. Days, weeks, maybe months. Not millions of years. These fossils appear in coal deposits around the world. Entire forests buried so quickly that the trees remained vertical as the sediment encased them. What force could bury forests that fast over such wide areas? Flooding. Massive, catastrophic flooding carrying sediment loads that would dwarf anything we see in modern rivers. Speaking of coal, the entire existence of coal deposits presents a problem for gradualist geology. Coal forms from plant material buried under pressure, but the sheer volume of coal worldwide requires unimaginable quantities of vegetation all buried simultaneously. The coal seams in Appalachia, the deposits in China, the fields in Europe. How much forest would need to die and be buried at once to create that much coal? And where did all that vegetation come from if the planet was supposedly covered in ice during the periods when these deposits formed? One explanation fits: a global catastrophe that ripped up massive amounts of vegetation, transported it via flooding, and buried it under sediment loads so heavy and so fast that the organic material never had time to decompose. It just sat there, compressed, and turned into coal over subsequent centuries. Then there are the erratic boulders. These are massive rocks, sometimes weighing thousands of tons, sitting in locations where they do not belong. The geology of the boulder does not match the geology of the surrounding area. Standard theory says glaciers carried them. Ice sheets advanced, picked up boulders, and deposited them hundreds of miles away when the ice melted. This is possible. We know glaciers transport rocks, but some of these erratics are sitting in places where glaciers cannot explain them. There are granite boulders from Scandinavia sitting in the middle of Germany, limestone blocks from Canada resting in the American Midwest, massive rocks perched on hilltops where glaciers never reached. How did they get there? One explanation that fits the evidence is water. Tsunamis of such magnitude that they carried house-sized boulders inland and deposited them wherever the water receded. Megafloods powerful enough to move objects that glaciers could not. Randall Carlson has documented this extensively in North America. The channeled scablands are the most obvious example, but flood scarring appears across the entire Pacific Northwest, down into Oregon, across Montana, even into Wyoming. Carlson points to flood bars, areas where water moving at tremendous speed dropped sediment loads as it slowed. These bars contain boulders the size of cars mixed with sand and gravel. The only way to create that mixture is catastrophic flooding moving faster than any river on Earth today. He calculates the water volume required to carve these features. We are talking about flows that make the Amazon look like a stream. Water moving at 60 miles per hour, hundreds of feet deep, scouring bedrock and carrying megatons of debris. Where did this water come from? The standard answer is the Missoula floods. Ice dams breaking and releasing glacial lakes. That is part of it. But Carlson argues the scale is even bigger. He suggests the Younger Dryas impact melted portions of the ice sheet so rapidly that water volume exceeded anything the Missoula theory accounts for. Look at the Grand Canyon. Officially, it was carved by the Colorado River over millions of years. Slow erosion, gradual cutting. Except the Colorado River is tiny compared to the canyon, and there are side canyons with no river at all. How did those form? Geologists wave their hands and talk about tributary streams over deep time. But engineers who study water erosion look at the Grand Canyon and see the signature of catastrophic drainage. A massive body of water breaching a natural dam and carving the canyon in a geological instant. Not millions of years, days, maybe weeks. Submarine canyons present the same problem. Underwater gorges that cut through the continental shelves, extending from river mouths far out into the ocean. The Hudson Canyon, the Congo Canyon, the Monterey Canyon off California. These are enormous features, some deeper than the Grand Canyon, carved into the seafloor. How? The official explanation is turbidity currents, underwater sediment flows, but the scale does not match. To carve canyons that size would require sediment flows of unimaginable power occurring repeatedly over long periods, or a single massive event. Like sea levels dropping so fast that rivers suddenly had to cut down through hundreds of feet of newly exposed shelf before reaching the ocean. Ice core data from Antarctica and Greenland shows rapid climate shifts. The ice preserves atmospheric chemistry year by year. When researchers drill down to the Younger Dryas boundary, they find temperature swings that should not be possible. The cores show warming of 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade, then cooling, then warming again. This is not gradual climate change. This is chaos. Something massively disrupted atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns. The leading candidate is meltwater pulse events. Enormous volumes of fresh water dumping into the oceans, disrupting salinity, shutting down currents, and triggering runaway climate feedback loops. Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred around 14,600 years ago. Sea levels rose 50 feet in less than 500 years. Some estimates suggest the rise happened even faster, possibly in under a century. That is catastrophic by any measure. Coastal settlements would have been inundated with zero warning. Meltwater Pulse 1B happened around 11,300 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. Another rapid sea level jump, more coastlines submerged. If you were a coastal civilization during these pulses, your world ended. Everything you built disappeared underwater. Everyone who lived at sea level either fled inland or drowned. And when you tried to tell your descendants what happened, it became the flood myth. Because from your perspective, the whole world did flood. Everything you knew was gone. The black mat layer across North America is physical evidence of the Younger Dryas impact. It is a dark sediment band containing charcoal, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and shocked quartz. It sits at the boundary between Ice Age and post-Ice Age deposits. Below the black mat, you find megafauna fossils and Clovis culture artifacts. Above it, nothing. The megafauna are extinct. The Clovis culture disappears. Something reset the continent. The black mat is the signature of that event. Widespread burning, impact debris, catastrophic environmental collapse. This is not speculation. This is physical evidence you can dig up and hold in your hand. The rocks do not lie. The sediment does not have an agenda. The fossils are not pushing a narrative. They are simply there, telling a story that mainstream geology spent 2 centuries trying to deny. A story of catastrophe, of rapid, violent change, of flooding on scales that dwarf anything in recorded history. The evidence is global. It is undeniable. And it matches, point for point, what every ancient culture said happened. The myths were not made up. They were remembered, because the rocks remember too. What if the ancient texts are not mythology at all? What if they are historical documents? Eyewitness testimony preserved through generations, distorted by time and translation, but fundamentally describing real events that real people experienced. This requires a shift in how we read these texts. Stop filtering them through the assumption that ancient people were primitive storytellers inventing explanations for things they did not understand. Start reading them as people desperately trying to preserve information about catastrophic events they survived. Plato's account of Atlantis is the most famous example. Everyone knows the story. An advanced island civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of earthquakes and flooding. For centuries, scholars have dismissed it as philosophical allegory. Plato made it up, they say, as a cautionary tale about hubris and the gods punishing human arrogance. Except Plato explicitly states multiple times that this is not fiction. He says the story came from Solon, one of the wisest men in Athens, who heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels. The priests showed Solon ancient records preserved in their temples. They told him the Greeks were like children, with no memory of deep history. They said catastrophes periodically destroy civilizations, and only Egypt preserved knowledge across these resets, because the Nile's flooding protected them from drought, and because their desert climate preserved records. The priests gave Solon specific details. They said Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. That puts the destruction around 9,600 BCE, right at the Younger Dryas boundary, right when sea levels surged, right when civilizations would have been inundated if they existed on coastlines. Plato includes geographic details. Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, meaning past Gibraltar, out in the Atlantic. He describes the island's size, its concentric ring structure, its canal systems, its architecture. This is not vague allegory. This is a geographic and architectural description. Could Plato have invented all of this? Sure, he was a philosopher. He could write fiction. But why would he repeatedly insist it was true? Why frame it as coming from Egyptian sources? Why include details that serve no philosophical purpose? The simplest explanation is that Plato was reporting what he was told. Whether the Egyptian priests were correct is another question. But Plato believed he was passing on actual history. Now look at the Sumerian king list. This document, compiled from multiple sources, lists every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until around 2000 BCE. The early portion is bizarre. It describes kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood. After the flood, reign lengths dropped to more normal numbers, hundreds of years, then eventually to realistic human lifespans. Mainstream historians dismiss the pre-flood section as mythological. Nobody lives for 30,000 years. Obviously, the Sumerians were just making up legendary founders. But what if the numbers represent something else? What if they are not individual lifespans but dynastic periods? Or what if they are using a different time measurement system that we do not understand? The key detail is the flood. The king list explicitly states that at a certain point, the flood swept over the land. Then kingship descended from heaven again. This is not religious myth. This is a historical document marking a cataclysmic break in their timeline. Before the flood, one type of civilization. After the flood, something different. The Sumerians remembered the catastrophe. They recorded it in their official history, and they dated everything relative to it. The Book of Enoch is even more provocative. This text was removed from the Bible, excluded from the canon during the early formation of Christianity. Why? Because it contains details that made religious authorities uncomfortable. Enoch describes the Watchers, angelic beings who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge: astronomy, metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, magic. These beings interbred with human women, creating the Nephilim, the giants. God became angry at this corruption and sent the flood to cleanse the earth, strip away the religious interpretation. What are we actually reading? A description of knowledge transfer from one group to another, teachers arriving and sharing advanced information, genetic mixing between populations, and a catastrophic flood that destroyed the world that existed before. Sound familiar? This matches the pattern we have been tracking. Survivors from a pre-flood civilization spreading knowledge, the flood myths, the giants. It is all there in Enoch, preserved in text that church authorities tried to erase. The Mahabharata from India contains descriptions that sound disturbingly like nuclear war, weapons that create pillars of smoke reaching the heavens, entire armies incinerated in an instant, survivors whose hair and nails fall out, water becoming poisoned, the dead so numerous they cannot be counted. Krishna describes weapons that should not exist in ancient times, projectiles that glow like 10,000 suns, explosions that boil the oceans. Scholars call this poetic exaggeration, fantasy literature, but the descriptions are specific. They match radiation effects, burns, contamination. Even the archaeological site of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan shows evidence of extreme heat. Vitrified stones, melted brick, skeletons lying in streets as if death came suddenly. Something catastrophic happened there. Was it natural? Or could the Mahabharata be preserving a memory of weapons we are not supposed to believe existed in ancient times? The Popol Vuh from the Maya describes the destruction and recreation of the world multiple times. The current world is the fourth creation. The previous three were destroyed by flood, fire, and storms. The text describes how the gods tried to create humans several times, failing each attempt, until finally succeeding with the current version made from maize. This is not just creation mythology, this is a record of repeated catastrophes, with humanity surviving and rebuilding each time. The precision of the catastrophe descriptions is remarkable. The Popol Vuh mentions resin falling from the sky. That matches impact debris. It describes total darkness for extended periods. That matches impact winter. It describes waters rising and covering the land. That matches the flood. These are not generic disaster tropes. These are specific environmental conditions that would result from the exact scenario we have been describing. Egyptian texts from the Temple of Edfu describe the first time, Zep Tepi, when the world was different. They speak of an island of creation that was destroyed. They describe survivor gods who came to Egypt and established civilization. The texts were carved during the Ptolemaic period, but they claim to be copies of much older documents. The Edfu texts talk about restoring what was lost, recreating the knowledge of the ancestors, preserving wisdom from before the disaster. Even the Bible, stripped of religious interpretation, describes repeated catastrophes: the flood of Noah, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire from heaven, the plagues of Egypt that disrupt nature itself. These are not random moral tales. They are descriptions of environmental and cosmic disasters preserved in religious framework. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that many biblical texts existed in multiple versions. Stories were edited, details were changed, entire books were excluded. What we have as the Bible is a curated selection that fit the theological agenda of whoever compiled the canon. The excluded texts, the Apocrypha, often contain more elaborate descriptions of catastrophes and pre-flood civilizations. They were removed because they did not fit the narrative religious authorities wanted to promote. Ancient people were not stupid. They were not primitive. They lived through events we can barely imagine, and they tried desperately to record what happened so future generations would know. They carved it in stone. They wrote it on papyrus. They passed it down through oral tradition for thousands of years. And modern academia looks at their testimony and says, it is just mythology, just stories. Not real. But when the mythology from every culture describes the same events, when the texts match the geological evidence, when the dates align with climate catastrophes we can now prove happened, maybe it is time to stop calling them myths. Maybe it is time to start calling them what they actually are: history. Fragmentary, distorted by time, wrapped in religious language, but fundamentally true. The ancients witnessed the end of their world. They survived. They recorded what they saw, and they have been trying to tell us ever since. We just were not listening. So where does all of this leave us? We started with a simple question. Why do ancient myths from every culture describe the same global disaster? Now, after examining the evidence, the answer seems unavoidable. They describe the same disaster because they experienced the same disaster. It was not mythology, it was memory. The evidence is overwhelming. Geological proof of catastrophic flooding, ice core data showing rapid climate shifts, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis confirmed by multiple independent research teams, structures like Göbekli Tepe that should not exist according to our timeline, underwater ruins off coastlines around the world, the extinction of megafauna in a geological instant, astronomical alignments pointing to a specific date 12,000 years ago, ancient texts preserving detailed descriptions of catastrophe, and myths, hundreds of them, all telling the same story in the same sequence with the same details. This is not coincidence. This is not universal human psychology creating similar stories. This is evidence of a real event that nearly ended our species. We are a civilization with amnesia. Graham Hancock has been saying this for 30 years, and he is right. We have forgotten our own history. We have forgotten that there was something before, something sophisticated, something advanced, a civilization that existed on the coastlines before the waters rose and swallowed everything. And when that civilization was destroyed, survivors scattered across the world, carrying fragments of knowledge. They became the mysterious teachers in every culture's founding myths. The Apkallu, the Shemsu-Hor, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl. They were not gods. They were refugees trying to preserve what they could of a world that no longer existed. The establishment does not want to admit this because it requires rewriting everything. Textbooks, timelines, theories that have stood for centuries, careers built on paradigms that are crumbling under the weight of evidence. So they resist, they attack, they suppress, they protect the narrative at all costs. But the truth does not care about academic consensus. The truth exists in the rocks, in the ruins, in the texts, and in the myths that have been trying to tell us what happened for 12,000 years. And here is the part that should terrify you. It can happen again. The Taurid meteor stream is still out there. The debris field that struck us before is still crossing Earth's orbit. We are entering a period where encounters are more likely, and we are not prepared. We barely track these objects. We have no meaningful defense against a large impact. And governments are not warning us because they do not want panic. The ancients understood this. They built monuments to track the sky. They encoded warnings in stone. They preserved the memory of catastrophe so future generations would know to watch for the return. They were trying to give us a chance, and we ignored them. We called their warnings mythology. We dismissed their knowledge as primitive superstition. We are about to find out if that was a mistake, but here is what you can do. First, educate yourself. Do not rely on what you were taught in school. Dig into the primary sources. Read the research papers. Examine the evidence. Think for yourself. The information is out there if you are willing to look. Second, spread awareness. Share this information. Talk about it. Get people asking questions. The more people who understand that human history is not what we have been told, the harder it becomes for the establishment to maintain the cover-up. Third, look up. Pay attention to the sky. We live in a shooting gallery. Objects pass between Earth and the Moon regularly. Some we detect, most we do not. The ancients watched the heavens obsessively for a reason. Maybe we should too. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Seriously, this is not easy material. It challenges everything we have been conditioned to believe, but that is exactly why it matters. History is not settled. The past is not known. We are still discovering who we are and where we came from. And the more we discover, the stranger and more fascinating the story becomes. If this resonated with you, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell, because we are just getting started. There are more mysteries to explore, more evidence to examine, more questions that need answers. And I will be here, digging into the things they do not want us to know, asking the questions they do not want us to ask. The ancients left us a message, carved in stone and preserved in myth. The message is simple. Remember what happened. Watch for the return. Prepare, because the destroyer is still out there. And cycles, by their very nature, always complete. What else are we not remembering?